Hey everybody, welcome to RB's Tales from the Video Store. After watching all these videos and listening to podcasts, there's a lot of people who talk about their experience, renting movies, buying movies, the mom and pop era. And I actually grew up in a video store, basically. My parents opened up their first video store in 1984. They had multiple stores at one time. They shut down around 1995, but I had uncles and cousins that had video stores that lasted all the way until like 2004. I had friends that worked at Blockbuster and other lesser known video store chains. So I've basically been on the front line of the video store for almost my whole life, or half my life. And I've actually got quite a few stories I can talk about. Everything from, insurance scams, FBI busts, robberies, drug trafficking, quite a few things. Plus, I like movies. I still love movies. I sell movies. And it's in my DNA. So I figure I'd start this channel up, try to build a community. I have quite a few stories to tell. I'd like to hear from other people who have similar experiences. And I thought we'd start out with, the year 1984, which was the year my parents opened up their very first video store. So let's get this video rolling and see what happens. 1984. Ronald Reagan was president. Russia withdrew from the Olympics. MTV aired their first music awards, and the slogan, "Where's the Beef?" took over pop culture. Do They Know It's Christmas was released by Band-Aid to raise money for famine in Ethiopia. Rick Allen from Def Leppard survived the car accident that cost him his left arm. So if you air drum with both arms. And I hope I'm saying this guy's last name right. Gary Plosh unofficially earned Father of the Year. If you just want to look up Father of the Year 1984 Gary, I'm sure what I'm talking about will show up and you'll know exactly who I'm talking about. But most importantly to me, 1984 was the year my parents opened up their first video store. I was only 4 years old at the time. My parents' video store was on Elm Street, directly across from the city park. So when it was summertime, I'd get to go over to the park and play and hang out all day. This is way before the era of cell phones. Now we did get video game systems and Nintendo, Sega, and all that eventually. So I would play quite a few video games. Coming up in a few years. Plus, being on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger would make an appearance around Halloween, which was basically my dad dressed up as Freddy doing Polaroids. That was pretty cool. But also in them early days, you had to pay for a membership. It wasn't free to just go in somewhere and give them your phone number and rent a movie. So my parents would have you fill out an application. They'd take a Polaroid of your license plate on your car. Stuff like that. They also had this baseball bat mounted behind the counter with a late charge collector etched in red on the back of it. This bat would come into play in the future, and I was actually there one time when it was almost used on a customer. But we'll get to that in the future. We had the popcorn machine, the candy machine with, the 3 columns for chiclets, bubble gum, and, some dry candy or whatever. Sometimes it'd be hot tamales, sprees, stuff like that. And we had a vending machine out front that, had ski, RC Cola, stuff like that. So when I'd go to the store, the video store, I'd get free popcorn, I'd get free candy, and I'd get a free soda if I wanted it, So, and get to take movies home for free. video games home for free. At this time, it was normal life for me. You know, it didn't seem special at all. And like I said before, I watched multiple videos and listened to multiple podcasts with people talking about growing up renting movies from their favorite mom and pop stores. So I figured, hey, I was right there in the front line. I might as well throw my hat in the ring, even though I'm late to the game. Doing something like this, I should have done in the beginning. I mean, all the way back in the 90s, me and my friends used to get the little boom box that had the mic in the corner, and we'd put a blank cassette tape in there, and we would create our own, you know, podcasts. You know, we'd watch movies and make up commentary, make up like little radio stories and stuff. We'd add sound effects, and we had a real good time with all that. But, you know, just life gets in the way. You know, you just think, you watch all these YouTube videos like, well, man, you know, that's not something I can do. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and try it. You know, see how it goes. And like I was talking about before, I've got stories with, you know, weird customers, robberies, drug trafficking, FBI, insurance scams, you know, mafia style meetings with all the local video store owners meeting once a month to discuss business and customers to blackball. You know, I got to actually go to some of those. You know, as a child in the 80s, you know, you'd go with your parents to a lot of things, but, you know, sit and be quiet. But while I was being quiet, I was listening, you know, and I remember quite a bit. Now, I remember everything? No. But I remember some of the, you know, more explosive events, you know. And, you know, even hanging out with Chris Christopherson, you know, we'll get to that story, you know, in the future. So, today we're going to take a look back at the top 10 VHS rentals from 1984. Pulled all this information from various online reports and, you know, old photos of, you know, these little magazine snippets where, you know, businesses would get these little, I don't know, magazines with a sheet that would show you, you know, top sales, top rentals, you know, this and that. So we're going to get started with number 10, Terms of Endearment. I actually have no memories of this movie. I was 4 years old when it came out. It definitely wasn't on my watch list, but I mean, it does have a stacked cast. Deborah Winger, Jack Nicholson, Danny DeVito, and John Lithgow. You know, funny enough, Jack Nicholson and Danny DeVito would move on, you know, to both play Batman villains in the future, Joker and the Penguin. And my earliest memories of John Lithgow was his face on the VHS cover for Raising Cain. You know, like one side was like an X-ray and the other side was normal. And of course, you know, Harry and the Hendersons. That's where I probably watched him the most as a child. From the cover of this box alone, you can tell it was a tearjerker for its time, and you know, my 4-year-old mind wouldn't have known what I was watching anyways. I would have turned this off and probably turned on Mighty Orbots, Transformers, you know, cartoon or something. The number 9 rental of that year is Police Academy. Now, you know, Police Academy is rated R, but I watched it constantly growing up. You know, I loved watching Bubba Smith rip that car seat out and sit in the back seat of that car because he was so large. The Blue Oyster Bar, you know, which would be a running gag in the future, you know, installments of this movie. Michael Winslow with his sound effects, you know, even though looking back on it, I can make those same sound effects when I was a child, you know, making gun noises and stuff, but it was still funny, you know. And then you got Commander Lassard, you know, giving that speech at the podium, you know, and something special happening to his lower region, and him walking away, and there's Mahoney looking out, smiling at him, you know, even though it was that stripper or valet that they had hired. And then, of course, Tackleberry with his guns, you know, his Dirty Harry Magnum. Even though I did do a little research, you know, and I know in the first movie he's actually, you know, using an S&W Model 629, not a, you know, Dirty Harry gun. I also remember Police Academy and Police Academy 2. they came in these big oversized boxes. You know, they wasn't like the little normal VHS size box. Like, let's see what we got here. You know, so you got a regular old VHS. You know, Police Academy 1 and 2 is like in these huge Warner Brother clamshells, you know. And the only other movies that came in that oversized box or that size was wrestling, cartoons, and adult movies. So, but you know, some of the early VHS releases had those big boxes, but you know, I believe they slimmed them down all to these smaller sizes anyway, because at the video store, you know, real estate was important. You know, you don't want a shelf with, you know, all these big boxes. You know, you want to cram as many movies as you can, you know, because if you can't set a movie out, it's not going to rent. So I believe that might be one reason why. I could be wrong, you know. That's just my take on it. Trying to put myself back, you know, if I was back in the video store. But like I said, Police Academy 3, they went to the normal size box, you know. So, and also, you know, Police Academy in the future got a cartoon, you know, which quite a few rated R movies got turned into cartoons. We'll talk about those in the future too, you know, Toxic Crusaders. You know, if you was a normal parent, you know, and your child went to the video store and picked up Toxic Avenger because they were watching Toxic Crusaders, you'd probably be extremely unhappy, you know, and you wouldn't want your child to be scarred like I was. I mean, that's all I watched. You know, I watched cartoons and scary movies, you know, growing up. That's mostly it. The number 8 rental is Scarface. Believe it or not, I've never watched Scarface. I've seen some of it here and there on TV, but I've never had the urge to bring the, you know, VHS or DVD home and sit there and watch it. You know, every music artist on MTV Cribs, you know, would have Scarface curtains, Scarface shower curtain, you know, Scarface t-shirt, you know, and all the important scenes have been referenced to death in every other form of media. So I've just never had no urge to watch it, you know. Of course, you know, I've seen a YouTube video, you know, say hello to my friend, all that, you know. The number 7 rental of 84 is Stephen King's Christine. I did watch this a lot growing up. You know, the perks of, you know, growing up in a video store. You never had to pay for anything. If it was in, just take it home and, you know, bring it back the next day. You know, of course, when I was little, I was always amazed at how the car, you know, healed itself. You know, being young, you don't know how effects work. And I'm like, man, how did this car, you know, go back after being destroyed almost, you know? You know, and as a kid, I always thought Christine was like a 57 Chevy. You know, it's a Plymouth Fury, you know, but for some reason when I was little, I was like, man, it's a 57 Chevy. You know, it was directed by John Carpenter, you know, of the Halloween and the Thing fame. You know, I believe most boys, when they're young, were intrigued by car movies and television shows. I was, you know, watch Dukes of Hazzard, to the Fast and the Furious, you know, to Bigfoot back in the day, back to Gone in 60 Seconds in 2000. You know, a young boy's imagination with his Hot Wheels and Matchboxes, you know, before phones, you know, my imagination would run wild, you know. So anything that had a car or something in it, that was the focus, you know. Christine, that in the 90s, USA Network had that made-for-TV movie, Wheels of Terror. You know, I watched that all the time. But, you know, almost anything that's got cars stuff in it was always cool to me. You know, Fall Guy, anything. Number 6 for 1984 is Flashdance. Now, the only thing I can remember about this movie is Jennifer Beals sitting on the floor, you know, just like the album cover is. You know, the soundtrack to the movie was huge, you know. It had 2 number 1 hits with What a Feeling and Maniac. Spent 2 weeks on the Billboard 200 at number 1, I believe. But I'm not much on dance movies. You know, I barely watch Dancing with the Stars or something with my wife. So and I don't like to dance anyway. So, you know, this movie isn't, you know, reaching out to me for me to want to watch it all the time, you know. Of course, I've seen that, her dancing on the stage and dumping the water on her and stuff. You know, everybody remembers that stuff. But I know you figure that girl, Jennifer Beals, would have moved on to do something, you know, be in another big movie. Because, you know, Flashdance was so popular back in the day. I mean, even as a child, I knew everybody liked it. You know, I think my mom had the soundtrack. But she never really did anything. You know, doing a little bit of research, you know, the only other thing I ever saw her in was she's in The Grudge 2, which, you know, she wasn't the main character. And she went on to star in The L Word on Showtime, I believe. It's nothing I've never watched or have no urge to want to watch, you know. I'm sure that's for, you know, mostly for women to watch. So, but then number 5 is another dance movie, you know, Staying Alive with John Travolta. You know, I don't have many memories of this movie, watching this movie either. I know John Travolta's in it. Frank Stallone is in it, you know, and it was directed by Sylvester Stallone of all people, you know, Rambo fame. But, you know, for a movie that came out in 1984, the main theme is Bee Gees' Staying Alive, which came out in 77. So I'm assuming that song was dated by then, you know, already probably being used for commercials and stuff. But my earliest memory of John Travolta is Look Who's Talking, you know, him being the dad and that. So he did, I did see him in some other things growing up. Like, we had a big satellite dish growing up, so we got to watch a lot of cool channels. You know, we'd get, I mean, I don't know if they were free, but I know in the early days when we had that big dish, you could watch like Mike Tyson fights, wrestling pay-per-views, and I remember it was just like turning, you know, using a motor and turning the dish to a certain degree, and that's how you watch stuff. I don't remember what channel I watched these on, but I know I saw John Travolta in a movie called Blowout with the girl, that Nancy Allen, who was in Carrie. And, of course, Carrie, you know, that's all I remember seeing him in before, you know, Pulp Fiction and Face Off and all that stuff, you know, later on in life. But moving on, the number 4 rental of that year is something I watched quite a bit. The Making of Michael Jackson's Thriller. Now, in the future, we'll talk about Moonwalker, which I don't care what anybody says. I loved Moonwalker. You know, him turning to that car, a robot, you know, kids being in peril. You know, it to me it was cool. So, but I did watch Michael Jackson's Thriller a lot, or The Making of Thriller. But all I would ever really watch is a music video. You know, once it got to all the, you know, backstage stuff, which it did make me feel better, because, you know, when you're a little kid and you're watching, you know, Day of the Dead or Return of the Living Dead, you're scared of everything. It's almost like, why am I forcing myself to watch these movies all the time? But I did, you know. And even like Thriller, you know, would make me, oh man, be scared a little bit. And then you'd see this behind the scenes where they're putting the contacts in his eyes and stuff, and make you think, oh, okay, well, you know, it's fake, you know. But, you know, still at the end when all them zombies are getting ready to reach and grab that girl, and she can't, there's nowhere for her to go, you know. It's like I had nightmares like that when I was little. So, but, you know, I watched Michael Jackson's Thriller quite a bit, and that making of VHS was the number 4 rental of 1984. Now we're going to get on to number 3, which is Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know, stars Harrison Ford of Star Wars fame. Of course, as a kid, the only thing that I could tell you about this movie is, of course, that guy's face melting. I would almost have to look away. I would watch this movie, and I knew when it was getting ready to hit, and I'd have to like look away or look down, but then peek and watch that guy's face just melt off while he's screaming. You know, it was like nightmare fuel. But another tidbit about Raiders of the Lost Ark, when it come out, it was sold at $39.95. Now, if you're watching this video, hopefully you are. I know it's going to be hard to get another channel started from scratch that talks about movies. But I'm sure a lot of you guys know VHS tapes back in $100 most of the time. More of the stuff that they knew would sell a whole bunch would be in the 70s, $79, $80. But that was always like your, of course, I'll do the research in a future video, but I'm going to say stuff like Gremlins, Short Circuit, stuff like that, would always be a little cheaper. And then, some tapes, could be $150, $160, and it'd be the silly stuff. Well, I'm not going to say the silly stuff, but those adult thrillers, might have a little bit of a nudity and sensuality to them. Some of those would be expensive, or some no-name horror movie would be like $120. And be like, why was that movie $120? Who's buying Extra at $120 a pop? Everybody. And not saying Extra was $120. I'm just using that as an example. But anyway, that was number 3, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Like I said, that face melting scene, always had to look away. It's almost like Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Large Marge. Whenever Large Marge was getting ready to change her face, it was almost like, oh man, I gotta look away. Number 2 is Risky Business with Tom Cruise. Now, I didn't watch this, back in 1984, but I have seen it, especially on TV, WTBS, 605. Well, not 605 Eastern, because that was made, that was a time slot for wrestling, but Saturday, Sunday afternoon, TNT'd show it, WTBS would show it, or it'd be on one of your local stations, So I always saw a TV version of it, I know he comes sliding in the frame, listen to Bob Seger's Old Time Rock and Roll. But I'm telling you who else is in this movie that, I probably watched more movies with him in it than I have Tom Cruise. Curtis Armstrong, Better Off Dead, Revenge of the Nerds. Better Off Dead is like one of my favorite movies. And Revenge of the Nerds is, extremely funny too, especially when you're a child watching this stuff. And also Bronson Pinchot, Balky from A Perfect Strangers. And I used to love watching Perfect Strangers, Balky was the man. And the number 1 rental of 1984, Tootsie with Dustin Hoffman. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I've never watched this movie either. Even as a child, I had never had any urge to want to watch this. I've never seen it on TV. Actually, walking around my parents' video store, which I did quite a bit when you're young, this is before phones, this is before tablets, either, sit and be quiet, read a comic book, which I did quite a bit of, or walk around and just look at boxes all day. I did that sometimes, hover around the X-rated room and try to catch a glimpse of that door opened up, take a peek in the room I'm not supposed to go in. But I did see Tootsie quite a bit. I always thought it was a woman on the cover. And of course, it used to sit right next to the movie Annie, which both them boxes kind of look the same to me, flip them, look them on the back, and I'm not reading the synopsis or nothing, I'm just looking at pictures, I'm 4 years old, 5 years old. But anyway, that film also has Terry Garr in it. She was in Young Frankenstein, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I don't have much to say about Tootsie. Maybe I'll watch it in the future for a movie review because I've never seen it. But, it's not nothing that I'm, itching to see. Like I said, growing up, it was mostly horror movies. The cartoons, stuff like that in the 80s and 90s. As you get older, you appreciate, regular films more, Also in 1984, though, there was quite a few big movies that hit the theater. One of them is Ghostbusters. Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis, Ernie Hudson, Sigourney Weaver, Rick Moranis, And what are my first thoughts of Ghostbusters? Besides the movie, Slimer, the cartoon that came from it, the candy, the toys. There was even the Slimer candy that was in like a toothpaste type, container. And then I believe they actually had Ghostbusters toothpaste, Colgate or Crest or somebody made it, So, that's what I remember most about Ghostbusters. Plus that that Nintendo video game, which we'll talk about in the future. It took me a while to even learn how to play that right. And then even when I figured it out, it wasn't that fun. So, Gremlins also come out in '84 at the theater. Don't feed Gizmo after midnight. Don't get them wet. Stuff like that. But what I remember the most about that film is really Corey Feldman, because Corey Feldman was also in another movie in 1984, which I watched a lot more than Gremlins. Friday the 13th, the final chapter. He was that kid that was into special effects and stuff like that. And I'm like, man, how come I can't figure out how to make masks and do all this cool stuff? Anyway, Never Ending Story also came out. Every kid watched that. Of course, I was pretty young, and I'd always, think, how come that boy reading the book also isn't Atreyu? That always confused me. Another movie, a kid trying to hide from older kids or other kids that were messing with him. He reads his book, you got Falcor, Of course, the horse dying in the quicksand goop or whatever, And, you keep thinking, well, man, he's going to pull this horse out. And no, horse dies, And I don't know about you, but when I was little, sometimes I would rewatch a movie at like 4, 5, 6 years old and think, well, maybe it'll be different this time. Maybe it'll change. Of course, it never was, because if it did, Optimus Prime would have survived, Transformers 1986. So, and another movie came out to theater, A Christmas Story. So, I don't know if they realized how big this movie would become. It'd go on to be that, 24 hours of Christmas Story, which still goes on today, I believe. I haven't had normal satellite or cable in a few years, but I'm sure it still happens. And I know when we got this movie in the video store, it was almost like, man, I can watch this anytime I want. And this is in the 80s. But it never felt right. It could be June or July and try to take that movie home and watch it, and it's not actually Christmas time. Still a good watch, but it's, best to be watched in the time of season it needs to be watched, holidays. I could go on about a lot of other things, but I'm going to be more in-depth about a few of these other movies in the future. A Nightmare on Elm Street, of course, came out in '84, which, my parents' video store was on Elm Street. So, that was always cool. My dad would tease me and tell me, oh, man, this is, Freddy's from this street. You better be good. He'd always try to get me. Like I said, I've got so many cool little tidbit stories that we're going to get into. Hopefully everybody enjoys them or has some kind of similar experience, like I did. Like I said, having a video store on Elm Street, and then, I can remember when Child's Play come out, we got this Chucky doll. And this is back when they did not make stuff like this. My dad scared me to death of that Chucky doll. It was almost full size, my buddy size. So, but Cannonball Run 2 come out in '84. That's another one I used to tear that movie up growing up. I love Cannonball Run 2. Karate Kid, The Terminator, like we talked about before, Revenge of the Nerds had come out, 16 Candles, and DC Cab with Mr. T. I've tried to watch DC Cab and it never could hold my attention. But, Mr. T's on the cover. Mr. T was at WrestleMania 1. Mr. T had a cartoon, So I always tried to watch that, and I never could, focus on it and watch it as a young child. Same as, another movie that I would look at the box, take it home, and I never could get through it. I should probably rewatch it now, but it was Dr. Detroit with Dan Aykroyd. always looked like it was cool, but I tried to watch it and I never could just sit down and pay attention to it. I'd always end up just doing something else, you know, mind of a little child. But anyway, that kind of wraps up the top rentals from 1984. We'll do year by year. I'll deep dive into a few stories, you know, as the years go along. Because we start getting into the late 80s and the 90s. You know, my memory is pretty sharp for, you know, some stories where the whole video might be a story about, you know, one of my uncles getting arrested by the FBI for, you know, making copies of tapes, you know. Yeah, people had get in trouble for, you know, like an FBI warning in the beginning of a movie. Well, it happened to one of my family members. So, got all kinds of stuff. You know, maybe a lot of my family members wasn't the best of law-abiding citizens, you know, which has given me quite a few stories built up, you know, which surely, you know, we wasn't the only video stores that had this kind of stuff going on, because I tell you, some other video stores in the town I grew up in, you know, some of the crooked stuff they did, you know, like my dad and their video store did, which I'm not going to get into everything on this video because I've got to spread it all out, or I could just make a, you know, a 3-hour documentary and be done. But, you know, like I said, I got quite a few stories. I'm going to share them on here. Hopefully people like hearing these stories. Hopefully we can all reminisce together about certain video titles, you know, that mom and pop era as it's been called. But like I said, I guess I'm going to do the cliche, drop a comment below. I look forward to giving you more insight on what it was like growing up behind the counter in a video store. Subscribe as we continue this journey together, and remember, be kind and rewind.